Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody joining us. We're super excited that you're able to join in and log in for this call. We're waiting, as we say, for Mario Beccia to be able to join us, the challenge of different platforms today, which is partly why we'll be talking about how we better collaborate across platforms in this conversation. This conversation was driven originally by the announcement of NATO announcing a sovereign cloud, but this is part of a bigger push that we've seen within the system on announcements about sovereign infrastructure, sovereign data, sovereign tech by countries, as they're trying to navigate this tension between privacy and security and local compliance and benefits of data sharing. And even over the weekend, we saw an article in the Wall Street Journal saying that actually some states, including South Korea, the UK and India and France and Germany and Saudi and the UAE, are wanting their data back from places so that they can enforce their own data and privacy and AI safety rules rather than relying on models structured or the infrastructure that are elsewhere and trying to get this control over the deployment of the architecture. So it's a really turning into one of the key questions that's going to underpin our innovation ecosystems, and in no more place than when we think about sharing some of the state's most secure data, which is in the defense ecosystem. So today's conversation, we're bringing together defense experts, technology experts, both defense and technology experts, to really try and look at these challenges and solutions to secure data sharing in this context. Without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Chris. Can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you're interacting in this sphere?
I'm sorry, I need to step in just one more time and then that'll be it. I do want to mention that Mike Rogers, Admiral Mike Rogers, was supposed to be on this webinar, and unfortunately he fell ill to the flu this morning and will not be able to join us. So we're very sorry to hear that he wasn't feeling well, and we wish him well, but we're going to be continuing with the rest of our panelists.
Thank you. Chris, it's over to you.
Thank you. Well, firstly, I hope that Mike is watching us from his bed and enjoying the spectacle. So I was a soldier in the British Army for 40 years. The first half of my career was essentially about operations. I was a tank soldier. And the second half of my career was about capability development. And I've seen that from all perspectives. So I've been a budgeteer, I've been a requirement setter, I have been a fleet manager, and I've been a buyer. And then since I left the military 5 years ago, I've been a supplier, or I've been advising suppliers. So I've seen defense procurement in the round from all the relevant directions. In the last sort of 10 years, 15 years of my career, I became very interested in innovation, partly because I felt that the existing methods of procurement in MOD were pretty broken. And so when I left the military, I wanted to focus on innovation, on strategy, and on leadership, and have done that principally as an advisor to startups, mostly in the defense sector. Actually, I had a lot of startups outside the defense sector originally, but since the invasion, of Ukraine, the demand in defense has been extremely high. So I now focus mostly on defense startups and essentially digital startups, and where AI in particular plays a big role. So that's me, and I hope to be able to contribute something to this discussion as a result.
Thank you so much, Chris. Alon.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here, and thanks, Chris, for that introduction. I'm Alon Kaufman, the co-founder and CEO of Duality Technologies. I come from a background of data science, so I've done my PhD in computational neuroscience and have been in the data science space for many years. Before founding Duality, I was the chief data scientist of RSA Security, and that's where I connected the world of data science and security and bringing it together. At Duality, we basically provide a software layer that addresses a lot of the paradox that we'll be talking about today, and that's really sovereignty versus collaboration. And that paradox. It used to be something that you have to choose a side. Are you sovereign or do you collaborate? Is something that Duality solves, essentially allowing organizations to derive insights and share insights without the need to actually share the data or share their secrets. So moving from the data space to the insight space, not sharing data, but yes, sharing and deriving joint insights. And looking forward to this interesting panel. And thank you, Mario, for joining us. Just in time.
So we're delighted to see Mario has made it onto the platform. We were just saying that one of the greatest challenges is platform collaboration that we're trying to solve, and the infinite amount of platforms that we all have to deal with. So you're just in time to introduce yourself and where you sit within this framework.
Thank you. And sorry again for the problems. As you said, plenty of platforms, different security settings, a nightmare. But let's forget about it. And, good afternoon or good evening, everyone. My name is Mario Beccia. I'm the Director of Readiness and Operations in the Cyber and Digital Transformation Division here at NATO. I've been working in information technology for the past 30 years, 25 in security and cyber security. I've been in NATO for a long time as well. I am one of the directors of the NATO Integrated Cyber Defense Center today. So very happy to be here. I've been working in defense also, obviously, with NATO for a while as well. Very happy to be here tonight.
So I'd like to kick off by going back and drilling into this little bit about narratives of sovereignty. I'm a geopolitics specialist, so sovereignty comes from a long history that applied to very bounded territoriality and then has been expanded into different spheres as we've expanded to different spheres, to sea, to space, so now to data. And sometimes is it a perfect fit or not? But I want to think I'm going to come to you, Chris, first, and think about from the UK perspective and from your background, what do you think states mean at the moment when they're actually talking about sovereignty, and particularly related to defense and AI? So from your perspective, what are the operational objectives behind it, and how can this coexist with collaboration on data?
Thank you. I think the bottom line is that there is no settled answer to this question. It's a very live discussion. It was complex before we started talking about AI, but AI has made it more complicated, not least because models need to be updated. I think to some people, your question is oversimplified into the issue of where does data reside? But in reality, there's more than one dimension to this issue. I think in an ideal world, states would want what you might call decision sovereignty. That they need national authority over model behavior in combat, the ability to override, to retask, or to disable AI systems at will, and with assurance that no external actor can degrade or interfere with performance. They need operational assurance and resilience. They don't want to be dependent on vendor-controlled update cycles or export controls, and they need assured access. They want security that prevents model exfiltration or training data leakage or covert telemetry. And they must have legal and political accountability. For example, they can't leave it to others to certify compliance with the laws of armed conflict. And they need to be able to scale or retrain or shift priorities without commercial or other frictions. But, and this is crucial, what they don't want all this to mean is isolation, every nation operating on its own. That would be a big backward step. Quite the reverse. They actually want to be able to collaborate more and better than we already do. Because if sovereignty becomes a reason not to share, we will not win, we will lose wars together.
Thank you. And I can see Alon nodding. So before I come to Mario on that, because I'm sure he's heard that from multiple people. But Alon, you seem to want to jump in there. So what's your addition to that?
First of all, I totally agree with Sir Chris. There's kind of layers here. And the basic foundation is, of course, to maintain every nation to make sure that they control the data, control AI, control the infrastructure, have this what's called today an AI factory that they totally control all of it. And that's, let's call it the foundation or the sovereignty layer. There's a layer on top of it, which I think Chris started to allude to, which is really the information layer. And in the information layer, it's where you want to make sure that you're utilizing the information. So the goal isn't just to keep your data in a closed area, it's actually to start to collaborate and use it to fight the future world. So it's definitely on top of the foundations of the sovereign cloud is this information layer that I'll be happy to relate to later.
Thank you for that. And again, if this becomes really challenging, obviously, as Mario is going to fill us in, as we get more countries into the picture, I think there was a recent UNESCO study that looked at 69 countries, 82% of which do not yet have a national level data strategy, which adds, I'm looking at a weary nod there from Mario. So Mario, from you're here talking to us from with your NATO hat on, and from your perspective, are these challenges resonating with you? And you could tell us a little bit about the sovereign cloud and how much is this going to help resolve these problems?
As Chris was saying, this is a very complex issue, and I don't think there is a unified answer or a unified strategy to that. And we can see that different allies are following and different nations are following different strategies in different paths. And I suppose that it's still going to take a few years before we can really converge onto a consolidated methodology or mechanism. At first, what I would add to what was said already is that we can definitely recognize 3 levels of sovereignty when it comes to machine learning and our artificial intelligence, as we say today. The first level is the training data sovereignty. So as Alon was saying, I mean that we need massive amounts of data to train artificial intelligence applications, artificial intelligence models. And the amount of data is so massive that human variety is almost impossible. So we don't do that. And so we basically trust the fact that companies that are training these models are doing the right thing, taking the right data sets, and especially monitoring the quality of these training data sets. When it comes to the concept of sovereignty, it means understanding what is the governance of this process, where it is located, what are the geopolitical considerations that can be made on this process. The second level is model sovereignty. Creating an artificial intelligence model today is a very expensive operation. Let's face it, there are only a handful of companies today that can really do it around the world. And most of these companies are geolocated in one country. So the considerations that we can make, what are the trends that we can see, and what are the challenges that this poses. And the third element is inference sovereignty. So once you have the data and the training, the model train, you build an application with it and blah, 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 you actually need to use it. And using an artificial intelligence application is very complicated. It requires a lot of resources, a lot of energy. So keeping the pace of growth that we are seeing today, and especially the energy support, the energy consumption that models and artificial intelligence is requiring today, again, is a matter of national security and probably requires certain considerations on sovereignty. How do we gather all of this together? Now, when it comes to the cloud, you can do probably similar considerations. I would say that the interesting part that we are seeing is that there is clearly a different trend between cloud adoption for highly classified information. This is one trend, one strategy, one journey, and cloud adoption for lower classification applications, lower classification data. These two are basically following 2 different paths. The lower classification information, we are seeing more and more governments, military organizations using the public clouds for handling this information. And this is probably a good strategy because it builds a lot of resilience. We all know that cloud is an excellent mechanism to implement dispersion. So to basically disperse all of our data and applications in such a way that it's very hard for an attacker to destroy, disable, or steal it all. When it comes to highly classified data sets, this is a completely different matter, right? So public cloud is probably not ready to handle this kind of workloads, this kind of information. And the trend that we are seeing is that for this type of workloads, many governments are choosing on-premises, cloud in a box sort of solutions. Again, this is a current trend. I'm not saying it's the best. I'm not saying it's the right way to do it. And personally, I still believe that the hybrid model, where there is basically halfway between these two, where the contractor, the company that provides the solution, keeps the management and the operation of the lower layers of the stack. So the hardware part, the operating system, the patching, all these horrible things that we need to do to keep it going. That is probably one big way to go that has not been fully investigated yet. And this is what we're trying to do with these cloud pilots that we are starting and which you heard about, right? The project that we are starting in Poland.
Gosh, no, that's it's super interesting and explains a lot within these declassifications, and particularly now when NATO is bringing together its own secure cloud, presumably for its more classified sort of data sharing and information sharing. It's only one part of the picture. I want to come to you for a minute, Alon, and think about it, because I know you've expressed concern that part of this conversation about sovereignty sort of contributes also to this deglobalization and sort of a fear of stepping away from data sharing. So as you work at the forefront of creating these mechanisms and you understand defense, what do you think needs to be added into this discussion of sovereign clouds in the defense context?
Yes, definitely. And building off what Mario said, so Mario even described, even within a nation, it's starting to silo between highly classified and disclassified or less classified. We've seen the same trend between nations. So even if you stand up your sovereign cloud and your sovereign AI factory on classified and unclassified in between nations, the challenge is how do you make sure you don't create these black boxes so that the highly classified can collaborate with the low classified, and UK can collaborate with the US, that can collaborate with Germany, and all these levels. And it's important because the whole concept of NATO, the whole concept of really fighting the next war with AI requires training on data. And we want to have this capability not to do everything local, because we have to fight the bad guys together. So building on that, in the recent years, there's been advances in technologies around privacy that start to shift this paradigm from the need to share or the need to protect, the need to control or the need to work together. And they basically allow two conceptual things that address the points that Sir Chris and Mario were talking. One of them is typically when people think about the sharing, they imagine you bring all the data into one big kind of data lake. So you put all your data into one place, and that's, of course, is a nightmare because you basically, the contributors of the data lose control over it. So first concept is putting the data in one central place doesn't meet our sovereignty requirements, as it's probably not the right way to go if you want to have the different partners controlling their data. So the first set of capabilities that is now emerging is the ability to analyze data while it's federated without ever moving. So that is critical. A nation, organization has data, they want to utilize it in collaboration with others, but they don't want that data to ever leave their premises, their residence, or their sovereign environment. So that's one element. The second element is, in some cases, you do have to move things. You have to move models to where their data is. You want to combine data sets. So just staying in this kind of isolated world is not good enough. And here there's also advances that basically allow to work on the data without seeing it. And I know this sounds like eating the cake and keeping it as a whole, but it's really like that. So just as a simple example, if a UK analyst wants to check if a malware signature exists in a German database, it doesn't mean that he has to see the German database. It means that he can ask a question, run a model, and get an answer, just a yes/no answer or a risk answer, without actually accessing and seeing that data. So these privacy technologies shift the game and start to talk about cross-domain or cross-nation analytics. So even in Mario's example, you have the highly classified cloud, you have the non-classified cloud. This may be a sovereign nation state, and this can be a public cloud. We all know that there's so much data in the open source. So even these national securities have to access that data. So how do you do this cross-domain? And these technologies, specifically in this case, using post-quantum encryption technologies, allow this ability to run workloads that are highly classified on low classified environments or vice, and start to open up this world. Again, as alluded by Chris and Mario, there's no one silver bullet that will solve everything, but it's not a black or white situation. You can start running models, collaborating, while making sure that the data owners have full control on the data, but you're still working and doing things together.
Can I just add something there, Melanie? I think that it's tempting to conclude that for lower classification data, public cloud is the answer. And surely, from a perspective of an efficient, cost-effective delivery of a cloud service, the public cloud is the right answer. But it doesn't get you away from the problem. If you want to do stuff, share data and use AI, you've still got some work to do. It's not sufficient just to say we'll go out and get a public cloud. And it's too convenient to think this is only a problem at the classified level, the secret level. It's not. We have this problem at all levels of data classification. And we need tools like the ones Alon has been describing, but we also need like frameworks and ways of thinking about the problem that allow collaboration rather than hinder it. And I think that's what NATO is trying to do. It's trying to get us to a point where, rather than one single cloud or one single model or one single data lake, that we've actually got ways of working that facilitate the effective and efficient sharing of data and use of AI.
Thank you for that. I'm going to come to you, Mario, in a minute for your reactions to that, but I'm going to just put this in the context. We have one question from Malcolm Ward from CNI Scotland. Thank you for the question, Malcolm, who had said that, and I guess whether your approach resolves this, or Mario, be interested in your thoughts also, he's saying that whether the question shouldn't be about the data sovereignty, which is really difficult to police, but how do you verify the origin of the data and the quality and veracity that we're using? And Alon, there's an approach that you're talking about address that from the outset.
Of course, data quality, trust on data is a critical component. We all know that AI is just as good as the data that comes into it. And protecting data and controlling data doesn't improve its quality necessarily. So these are somewhat independent questions. I think that the data quality is a critical component here. And the minute we make sure also that the owner of the data curates its data, maintains the data, structures its data, you probably, unless someone is doing a malicious activity, you're actually getting higher quality versus putting all the data in one data lake and asking a third party to kind of govern it and monitor it and curate it. So there's advantages here also to data quality if the different countries keep their own data and use it. Of course, there are new technologies trying to evaluate value of data, of course, fairness of data, try to attribute contributions, but that's, I think, a parallel discussion to how do you protect that actual data during the processing or during the collaboration.
Clarify. For clarifying that. I want to come back to you, Mario, because also thinking about how you envisage from your perspective some of what Chris has said, also that it requires a framework, and does NATO have the frameworks in place to operate with this? And I think it also reflects a question that we've got in the question box from Dan, who also says, does the US CLOUD Act and EU GDPR and regulatory structures need to be adjusted and also to reconcile with some of these tensions to make this operational?
I think the starting point is that we do have a number of policies and frameworks in place today to determine how the various allies and the organizations of each of the allies come together and are supposed to share and integrate their processes, actually, not only share data. I think the real dimension to be analyzed here is not only about having the right frameworks in place, but also about having the political willingness to actually use them and make it happen. So if we think about what was said about cloud adoption and the need to have better tools to federate data together, as Alon was saying, we have technology that can do that today as we speak. But the reality is that many organizations are still looking at creating large data lakes, large databases. So basically, still using the model where you have the king of the hill that requests and requires and acquires data from everyone, and only then can process it. While if we look at other parts of information technology, video games or other industries that are not related to defense, this is happening today. I don't know how many of you are using Discord or any other online platforms like this. That is an incredible way to share data, to integrate processes without having to build one single container that contains everything. And I think that there is a sort of mindset switch that we need to go through before this can really happen. I don't think it is a matter of technology or a matter of rulings or governance. It's really about changing the way that we are all used to work, pretty much. I think the other interesting point is there's a number of things that can be done with regulations. You were mentioning the GDPR and the CLOUD Act from the US. These are conflicting regulations. We all know that. But does this really matter for defense? The moment we move from peacetime to crisis, is this really what we should focus on? At crisis time, before a war kicks in, or when there is a large incident on the ground, there's all sorts of situations that today should be tackled with a much higher priority, in my opinion. So how do we actually access information in a much faster way than what we are used to do at peacetime, for instance? During a crisis, you cannot wait 48 or 72 hours for a document to be declassified by an ally so that another ally can read it. And I have dozens of examples like this if you want. But I think that these are the kind of mechanisms where current technology can help a lot, but where we still have to do a lot in terms of changing our mindset before we can actually use it.
Yeah, can I add that?
I was going to say, I was going to turn to Chris for your thoughts on that, and I have a couple of thoughts, but go ahead, Chris.
I mean, this is a wicked problem because we all started moving at different times, and we're all moving at different speeds. To some significant degree, the journey that nations are going on is the same, but they started at different times and they're moving at different speeds. And so it's hard to come up with a single answer to this. As both Mario and Alon have said, we have to take steps along the road. But I think to make digital sovereignty and coalition data sharing workable at pace, the conversation needs to move from beyond where the data sits in the cloud to how partners jointly operate, govern, and assure AI-enabled missions. And the hardest part isn't actually about buying the infrastructure. It's building this machinery of trust. That's really where we all need to focus our attention. We need to deal with the conditions that each nation presents. Sure, they will each have slightly different regulations, infrastructure, and so on. But we need a framework of trust that enables us to operate together.
I mean, echo that completely. I've spent a lot of time working with governments in Africa where the concept of data colonialism and the fear of data exploitation that will echo a previous era of physical goods is very strong. And you're right, that building trust is what Mario said, that agreement on a framework. And I think it's interesting the sort of suspension, securitization in crisis and suspension of normal politics should be able to override it. I think the question, I'd like to throw this perhaps back at you, Chris, maybe Alon, and even yourself, Mario, that we already have different narratives of we're at war, we're at this level of war. We've been, if we think of hybrid warfare, we've been at long war for a long time. You're the security person. So at what point would we get agreement on where we get suspension, particularly in Europe, of a sort of suspension of a European regulation for a greater good of collaboration.
Yeah, I don't think we can't wait till we're in a crisis to work out what to do or how to operate. So we have to have agreements now. I was about to say now in peacetime. I think it's very debatable whether we are actually in peacetime now. I think that these frameworks, these rule sets that I'm talking about, I remember when I was a young officer, a captain or a major, and I was a requirement writer, and we had NATO STANAGs, standards that were a common set of rules that all of the nations knew what they meant. And so we could simplify a lot of what we did by referring to the STANAG and using the STANAG. And then it meant that what we were doing was common to what other nations were doing. And I think we need that kind of thing for AI data pipelines, not a single tech stack, a data sharing playbook.
I want to step on what Chris said here. We're talking about trust, and trust is a lot of, up until now, is a lot really about agreeing on rules, agreeing on policies, regulations, and so on. And as Mario was saying, the whole notion of trust changes between war times and peace times, and we kind of balance things a little bit differently. Even this world of trust can move from more handshakes and lawyers to more technology and usage. So what am I talking about? So the whole essence here is that we're not talking about sharing the actual data, we're talking about the insights. So all the rules around sharing data, maybe we can solve them with mathematics versus with lawyers. Also with this world of AI, you have to verify that AI is doing what it's meant to do. That can be with lawyers, but it can also be done with technology. So there's a lot in the stack that to add, you're making sure that the data itself is never exposed. That's with encryption technologies, making sure that the outputs of these AIs are verified and go through verification processes so the output, A, doesn't leak anything that came in, because that was the goal to start off with. And the output is what you wanted, going also a little bit to the quality point. So there's a lot that we can layer here and make sure that the pace of advancement is really closer to the pace of technology versus the pace of lawyers and policy treaties.
As a recovering lawyer, I can empathize with that. And Mario, before I got there's a couple of questions from the audience, but do you have anything to add into in response to that?
Yes. So I think I'm definitely aligned with what Chris said and what Alon added. So the real point here is to really maintain a good balance between what Alon called the trust through technology and the trust through human relations, right? Before machines trust each other, humans have to trust each other. That is and unfortunately, it's a rule that we need to stick to. And today, as Chris was saying, one of the blocking factors is the difference in the maturity level that we have throughout the alliance, right? We have 32 allies. We should not hide behind by thinking that they're all at the same level. The maturity is very different across the 32. And with maturity goes trust, right? Higher maturity allies are reluctant in trusting their data to lower maturity allies. How can this be solved? Again, with standards. So establishing a baseline. And we have mechanisms to do that. We have something called the Cyber Pledge, with which basically every year we assess the maturity for cyber defense in each of the 32, and we try to set objectives and long, mid, and short-term objectives for the maturity level to be increased year after year. Now, when it comes to operational technology and operational objectives, this is a completely different story, as we all know. So how to port these mechanisms in an operational scenario, in a wartime scenario, this is a completely different set of questions that have to be posed. We do a lot of exercises across Europe and North America, and there is an opportunity to test how technology and people would behave in drastic scenarios, let's say. And year after year, you can see that the level of maturity grows and grows. And I'm trying to make sure that we don't get hooked up to a very negative picture of the situation. It's not as negative as it could look like. Of course, everything can be improved and everything can be perfected.
Thank you. And we've got questions coming in thick and fast, and please carry on. I'm going to come and turn to some of these. And I think, and you're right, it's the fact that we get to, these are huge advancements in getting to this cloud, and it's steps on how do we operationalize them. But I want to come back to Alon. There's a question that's come to you about, or thinking about enabling data collaboration in privacy preserving manner may also come as an energy cost. We talked, Mario, you talked a little bit about the sort of energy sovereignty and this challenge on having that supply chain security on the energy supply chain. Do you see that element of AI has already got high energy costs? Are these privacy preserving data collaborations going to increase that cost, and how can that scale practically?
It's a good question, of course, and there's a few dimensions here. So some of these privacy technologies in terms of processing require more overhead and hence more energy. Other technologies, they actually reduce that. So it's not one fits all. Some, like, if we're alluding here to homomorphic encryption, which is maybe the holy grail, which allows you to analyze data while it's encrypted, is way more expensive. But doing federated analytics, where you save moving the data and making it fresh, sometimes decreases it. So it's true, there's some dimensions that increase price, some dimensions reduce it. But also the picture that Mario was talking to, that every nation is building their own environment, their own cloud, their own data, their own infrastructure, also puts challenges on, let's say, not effective use of these resources. So there's multiple things. I think the key is always use the right tool for the right problem. In some cases, we can save with these technologies. In some cases, we have to pay more. Again, the goal at the end of the day is to fight together as a coalition in this world of AI. Training data together. Training data is expensive, and training data while protecting it is more expensive. But so we must remember the goal. But not all technologies have the same overhead, and some of them actually even save the energy.
Yeah, and if we're worried about the energy cost of some of these privacy enhancing technologies, then we should think about the alternative. What is the energy cost of moving, for example, vast amounts of data around the place? What is the operational cost of not being able to share data? So it's all a question of trade-offs. There is no single solution to this. It's a multidimensional problem. What we need to do is apply thought and consideration to the best way to manage these trade-offs. But I think as a general assumption, I would think these privacy enhancing technologies are generally less energy demanding than other ways of operating.
And that's a really valid point. So we're thinking about how can we gain the maximum effect for the lowest amount of cost that we're putting into that, from that multi-dimension of both energy cost but operational gain at each level. I've got another really interesting question coming back onto the question of trustability of data from Dennis. And the question goes, the trustability of data answers and service change over time, especially under adversarial scenarios. This question of, is the larger need really the ability to operate reliably despite data poisoning and covert exfiltration and service denial and policy changes? Should the focus be on explainable trustability that includes resilience to disruptive acts? Mario, do you have any thoughts on that?
Where can I start from? At first, the concept of trustability. I think the industry has been discussing trustability for a long time now. And one of the things that I would start from is, in this day and age, we're trying to put an additional layer of confirmation on top of answers, on top of data, on top of output that comes back from artificial intelligence applications, not putting the same level of trustability and explainability on human decision makers. So today, there seems to be a need, and probably it is more of a psychological issue, if you want, to make sure that what comes back from a machine can be trusted at 99%, while we all know that what comes back from a human cannot be trusted more than a much lower percentage. I think the estimate is around 60 or 65%. So we are trying to get a much higher performance from the machine rather than from the human. Is this accurate? Is this correct? Do we want to really explain to people and soldiers who are dying on the field, that we cannot use this application that is much more reliable because we believe that we need better trustability. So that is one big discussion that I think has moral implication and ethics implications as well, by the way, that has to be had. Now, the resilience discussion that is connected to all of this is also very important. Human resilience is very different from AI and machine resilience, right? Especially when it comes to theater applications, so to operations and processes that are executed during military operations. How do we make sure that these things keep running when we are in theater? One of the biggest considerations that we have today is that we still have a big issue of connectivity. All of us, we are used to having now connectivity that goes in the mega or gigabyte per second. In theater, we have connectivity that is in the kilobit per second. Let's face it. So how does this apply to this kind of applications, to this kind of situations? And what are the consequences? And I think that these are the elements that will have to be tackled before we scale up to higher level considerations even on trustability.
Thank you for that. I am aware that we are running out of time, and I know we still have an active audio. In fact, we've already run out of time given we started a couple of minutes late. We still have 3 questions in the box. To wrap up very quickly, so try and get to, I'm going to read those all out to you, and I want each of you as your wrap-up point to pick one of those to address. And as I say, each of these topics that we've raised in the question could have their own webinar, and particularly on the trust and building data framework. So the questions we've got, and I think this one is for you, Mario, though, is how does NATO plan to develop an application and software layer to act on the shared data layer that's being built? And then we have a couple of questions, one close to my heart, to thinking about how can European concerns on global data and sovereignty, are they undermined to extent when I think we already referred to it, when the stack itself is fundamentally, as you said, geolocated or under the governance auspices of one nation, and particularly the US. And then the other level from Ellen is thinking about when discussing maturity, and I think coming back to your point that people have started at different paces, they're running at different speeds. Where should countries with lower levels of maturity for digital sovereignty start, and whether this conversation can lead to deglobalization, or will these digital sovereignty narratives actually hinder growth into these other countries? So trying to put all those in, but thinking of those as we wrap up, and I'm deeply grateful for everyone in the conversation, everyone's staying on as we've run over a couple of minutes. Where would you like to throw your pennies worth in? And I'll start with Chris.
Yes, so I'd like to talk about concerns about the tech stack being located in the US, essentially. And you have to ask, what does a sovereign cloud actually mean, right? And I think there are levels to this. At its most extreme, it means a national cloud stack, which is domestic IP or fully controlled code base, national operators and supply chains. Okay, now that's hard to do. It's very expensive, and it's weaker at scaling and in terms of the pace of innovation. But that is an option. Remembering that if you cannot run it, patch it, constrain it, or fight it without a vendor, it's not fully sovereign. And you can therefore come one level down from that, I think, to the approach that I think, reading between the lines, this is the approach of the British government, that is foreign derived but sovereign controlled. Licensed IP, but with national operators and separate networks, with no sort of continuous vendor control. That allows governments to buy into existing development, but it still necessitates a significant national capability, and it's expensive. Less so than a fully national stack, but it is expensive, and it risks becoming isolated from updates. And then the lowest level is a kind of foreign hyperscaler technology with national data centers, local staff, and then some contractual or government guarantees. That's by far the cheapest option, and it's the easiest to deploy, but it's still subject to foreign legal, technical, and supply chain leverage. And I think the question really is for each nationality, each government, to decide where on this spectrum does it want to sit. And it isn't necessarily one answer for everything that it's trying to do. As I described earlier, most governments have essentially gone for the third lowest level for public clouds for their lower classification data. I don't have access to the contracts in the UK, but my impression is that the MOD is going with what they call a Google distributed cloud, that for its more complex or sensitive workflows, that requires strict data residency and security controls. They describe it as both hardened and air-gapped. So it's in my middle layer of cloud solutions. It's not fully, there's no way of getting around it. It's not fully and totally sovereign, but it is much more sovereign than just buying a public cloud from a foreign provider. And I think that's the way of addressing this problem. It's with different solutions to different needs.
Thank you for that. Okay, really running out of time, so I'm going to come to you Alon quickly, and then Mary, I'm going to let you have the last word. Alon.
Thank you. I'll just try and not address the questions, but maybe a mental image that can help. If we look at this discussion here on three levels, so there's the sovereign level, the information level, and the trust level. And let's just remember, the sovereign is not the goal. That's the foundation. So like we can look at the sovereign as a container, and the information level is really the connectors of the bridge to create value. And on top of that, we have to have this trust and policy, both technology trust, but also a human trust. So if you look at it that way, of course, you can make sure that the second level is first in place, and you need the third level. So the first level is actually, as Chris said, very expensive, but you can actually jump over it if you have the right measures in number 2 or 3. Of course, there's trade-offs with everything, but the essence is your data and your models have to be in your control, even if you use a third-party infrastructure. Yes, you lose resilience, you lose things, but you at least control your essence, which is the information, under, of course, your policies and your nation's goals.
Thank you for that vision. And Mario, from NATO's perspective and yours, what's the parting words you'd like to leave us with?
So I think connected to the question that is, so I think that if we look at the way that the relation between defense and industry has evolved throughout the last 25, 30 years, back in the 90s, defense professionals and defense entities were the top customers for technology providers. So we could go to any equivalent of today's Google, and they would basically develop anything for us. So we could have the most crazy idea, and that would be invested, developed, researched, and something would come up. Throughout the years, this relation has inverted. So now defense operators, defense entities, defense organizations are not anymore the top customers for technology providers. If I look at NATO as an enterprise, we are approximately 100,000 people, more or less. So we don't make such a large customer for the Google of the world. If we look at the defense organization, for the average ally in the organization is the same. Basically, we don't create that critical mass that can make our demands customizable by technology providers. So one of the big things that has been happening, and which I think is going to become stronger and stronger, is that the way that we conceive our requirements needs to be even more aligned with what industry is providing than what used to be in the past. Today, creating a standard is not enough anymore. Even the implementation should look at what are the architectural elements that are available on the market, products off the shelves, and maybe just make sure that they are all assembled in a functioning way, following our requirements. So I think my last message would be, in this day and age, it's next to impossible to do defense without industry support. And our language and our commitment to industry has to change and become even stronger.
Goodness, thank you. And I think that's opened up the potential. I know we could have gone on a lot longer, and hopefully this will be the first of many conversations that all of you out there will join us for. A huge thank you to Mario, to Chris, and Alon for joining us today. Thank you for all your questions and engagement. And we hope to see you all at another conversation at another time. And thank you again. Thank you, Michael and Duality, for hosting us and for inviting me to this conversation as well.